We've been taught over the last year that touch is a potentially dangerous thing. Avoid crowds, don't shake hands, don't hug, create barriers with face coverings and with gels and with distance. The rules go on and on. Touch has become something to be avoided, and for huggy people, this last year has been a complete nightmare. For those of us who perhaps value our personal space a little bit more, it's been great to have people laying off with the hugging for a whole year. Touch, connection, it's something that's really important for us as human beings, and one of the biggest difficulties over this last year has been the lack of that connection that comes from touch. The Gospels are full of stories about touch, especially about Jesus reaching out and touching people in healing and in love. We're reading in Mark through Lent at the moment, as you know, and the first few chapters, there are so many moments of touch that Mark records. So, for example, in chapter 1, Jesus is in the synagogue and a man with leprosy approaches him and begs Jesus, "If you're willing," he says, "you can make me clean." And Mark tells us, filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. And then in the same chapter, earlier on in chapter 1, Jesus has been with Peter and his family, and Peter's mother-in-law was ill with a fever. And Mark tells us, so Jesus went up to her, took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her and she began to wait on them. And eventually, so many people hear about Jesus healing that Mark says he had healed so many so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Could Jesus have healed those people without physical touch? Of course he could. He's Jesus, he's God. But touch makes Jesus real. Touch makes Jesus more than a powerful ghost or a spirit. He is real flesh and blood. When Jesus reaches out to touch people, he's connecting with them. Just listening to Jesus' words, hearing Jesus' words isn't enough. It takes real encounter with Jesus to really change him. We can hear him, we can read about him, but Jesus wants connection with us. Jesus wants us to know that he is real. Later on in the New Testament, John, one of the earliest disciples, begins one of his letters with these words. "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life." We've heard, we've seen, we've touched. This is John, one of Jesus' closest disciples, explaining who Jesus is, not in theory and not in abstract, but by experience. I've seen him, I've heard him, I've touched him, he's flesh and blood, and I'll tell you about him. Experience of who Jesus is in every possible way is important for John. Not just so that people will take notice of his letter, not so that it sort of gives them credibility, I guess, but because Jesus isn't someone to be explained. He's someone to be experienced. Now obviously, nowadays, we can't say that we have connected with Jesus in the same way as John did. John was one of the first people to follow Jesus during his time on earth, and John spent about 3 years living in Jesus' company. But we can know Jesus, and we can connect with him. We can even experience his touch in our lives as he leads us, as he guides us, as he strengthens us, as he loves us. And today we are going to hear a story about touch. We're going to hear 2 stories about touch, actually. And although they involve the physical touch of Jesus' hand, they also speak to us about how God can touch our lives.
When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still talking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began walking around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
Did you notice all the mention of touch in the two stories today? There's almost something superstitious about it, reaching out to touch Jesus' clothes as if what he wears has some kind of magical power about it. It's stories about two people who think or hope Jesus can do something, but they're not really sure how. And so they reach out to him, hoping that something will happen. And things do happen. Connection with Jesus makes things happen. And I'd like us today to think about what the touch of Jesus means to different people in our story, and also how Jesus responds to those who reach out to him. And as we do that, I hope that we'll learn what it means for us to connect with God, not with physical touch like we have here, but with spiritual connection, or with the touch of the Holy Spirit. First of all, in our story, touch brings hope. These are two stories about hope, or stories about lack of hope, actually, at least to begin with. So first of all, we've got Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders in Capernaum, and his little daughter is dying. And it's interesting, because to Mark, he's the synagogue leader. He's a man of some importance, but he doesn't trade on his status or on his importance when he comes to Jesus. When he comes to Jesus, he's a father who would do anything to make his little daughter well. What did he know about Jesus? Well, maybe not all that much. He's one of the synagogue leaders, one of the religious leaders in Capernaum. Jesus has been causing quite a lot of trouble in the area since he came on the scene. But somehow, in this radical man that he didn't fully understand and maybe didn't fully approve of, he found just a spark of hope for his daughter. And it's in the touch of Jesus, in connecting with Jesus, that he finds that hope, that he places that hope. He says to Jesus, put your hand on the girl so that she'll be healed and live. I have hope for life, said Jairus. And it's in you, Jesus. Jesus connecting with this child can transform death to life. That's the slim hope that Jairus has. The second person in the story, the woman, she more clearly lacks hope maybe than Jairus does. Here's a woman who Mark says has been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, I think any woman reading this, and the three Gospels which include this story, which is Matthew, Mark and Luke, were all written by men. I think any woman reading this story would give, well, let's just say a wry smile at the term subject to bleeding. It sounds so neat and tidy, doesn't it? When in fact, here is a woman who most likely has experienced regular, chronic pain for the last 12 years. An inability even to function at certain times of the month. A woman whose condition makes her spiritually unclean according to Jewish law, and whose condition actually would have meant she constantly had to manage physically cleaning herself and her clothes. Subject to bleeding, this tidy phrase, is horrible in every possible way, and it's hopeless. She's tried everything, spending all her money on the best care she could get at the time, and it's getting worse instead of getting better. But hearing about Jesus gives her just that sliver, that chance of hope. If I could just touch his clothes, she says to herself, I'll be healed. If I could just reach out to him, then maybe, just maybe, I'll be healed. There's hope in reaching out to Jesus when all other hope is gone. And of course, when she does reach out to him, she's healed, and more than healed, as we're going to see. But in the delay, as Jesus helps this woman, hope for Jairus is again dashed, because people arrive from his house with the worst news. Your daughter's died, they say. Whatever hope Jairus had is gone. And Jesus says to him, don't be afraid, just believe. And here's where real hope lies for Jairus, in the words of Jesus. Do not be afraid, just believe. This isn't over yet, Jairus, Jesus says. Don't be afraid, just believe. They are crazy words in the face of death. The crowds, the people who brought the news, everyone must have looked at Jesus and wondered, how could he say something like that to a man who has just lost his daughter? When things seem overwhelmingly bleak, Jesus looks the man in the eye and he says, trust me, I've got this. I'm not sure how much belief Jairus had. I'm not sure whether his fear completely left him when Jesus said, don't be afraid, but there's a spark of hope here because Jesus is involved. The second touch that I want to highlight, and I nearly made this what the whole sermon was going to be about, but then I changed my mind. The second touch is a touch of interruption. Mark is a gospel full of interruptions. There are so many times in Mark that Mark starts telling us a story about something that Jesus is doing, something where Jesus is, and then there's an interruption. And then Mark tells us that story before he goes back to the first story. Jesus' life is full of interruptions. Peter interrupts Jesus when he goes off to a quiet place to pray. The leper interrupts Jesus when he's in the synagogue worshipping. Some men even break a hole in the ceiling, in the roof of the house where Jesus is, interrupting what he's saying so that he can heal their paralysed friend. Jesus, when he sets off to go to Jerusalem facing the cross, he's interrupted by a blind man crying out to him. And the woman in our story today is probably the best known of these interruption stories. Can you imagine it? Jesus has just been told that a little girl's at death's door. He's on his way to save her, when all of a sudden he stops. "Who touched my clothes?" he says. There's an interruption. And the disciples say, "Oh, come on, there's a whole crowd of people around you. How can you ask who touched me?" You can almost hear them saying, "Come on, Jesus, there's a life at risk here. We really need to get going." But Jesus doesn't move. He doesn't brush it off and say, "Yeah, you're right, yeah, let's get going." Jesus stops and he looks around and he wants to find out who reached out to him. Jesus responds to the interruption not with impatience, but with a desire to know more. Why did you reach out to me? That's his question. What did you hope for in this connection? As human beings, we tend to think of interruptions as a bother, something inconvenient, something that's preventing us from doing the really important stuff. And in a way, that's how the woman thought of herself. Not important enough to take Jesus' attention. So she sneaks up behind him. And of course, Jesus, knowing that the power has gone from him, and how he knows that and what that means, I don't even know. But Jesus, knowing that something has happened, treats her not as a bother, but as someone to be loved and to be healed. I don't know, I wonder how many times we've thought that we don't want to bother God. God's got better things to do than deal with us and our stuff. It's such human thinking. God is here for us. God loves us. God can handle our interruptions. Jairus is also thought of as a bother. When the men come to tell him that his little daughter's dead, they say to him, "Why bother the teacher anymore? Why take Jesus away from his real work? Let him get on with the real stuff. The little girl's died." I was reading this week about a professor who used to get really annoyed with all the interruptions in his work. Until, he said, he realised that the interruptions were his work. Mark tells us very clearly what Jesus' ministry is all about when he starts his gospel. This is the good news about Jesus Christ, he says. And when Jesus comes along, he says, the kingdom of God is here. What is the good news for Jairus? What is the good news for the woman in this story? Is it for the Son of God to say, "Sorry, your interruption doesn't fit with my plans for today"? Or is it for him to see them? To see their need, to see what they need from him and to respond to them? Jesus is gracious in the way he deals with interruptions, not just here in chapter 5, but all through Mark's gospel. He sees them not as bothers, but as opportunities to show God's kingdom love in action. As humans, we're not always so good with the interruptions. We're more like the disciples. We're more likely to say, "Come on, Jesus, there's more important things to do here. We've got other plans." And obviously, we can't respond to every interruption in our lives. We're not Jesus. But we can learn from him. We can learn from him seeing kingdom opportunities, not in keeping our plans, but in going with the interruptions. For both people in this story, to reach out to Jesus also takes courage. Jairus, he was one of the officials at the synagogue in Capernaum. Capernaum, it's a small place, it's not especially important. Jairus, he's got a bit of influence in the community. He's maybe a little bit wealthier than his neighbours. It talks about servants, for example. And for the last few months, this radical teacher called Jesus has been in the area. He's made Capernaum his base. And last week we hear how Jesus healed a man in Jairus' synagogue, and it caused a huge amount of fuss. And then by the end of chapter 3, we discover that some important teachers from Jerusalem have arrived in Capernaum to check out what Jesus is doing. And they've declared that Jesus is possessed by Satan. So to have Jesus around is awkward for religious leaders like Jairus. And so when his little girl is facing death, coming to Jesus right in front of everyone takes a good deal of courage. There's a big crowd gathered around Jesus. Everyone can see what's going on. And Jairus has to put away his reputation. He has to put away his pride. He has to put away what he's been told about Jesus. And he humbles himself in front of Jesus, and on his knees he begs Jesus to save his daughter. And that takes courage. It takes courage, it takes humility, it takes faith, and a whole lot of things to come to Jesus and to say, I'm handing this situation over to you. I can't do anything, but I trust that you can. And that's what Jairus did in front of everyone in the town. Jairus came to Jesus in full view of everyone. The woman, on the other hand, she comes up behind Jesus, sneaking up on him. But this also took courage, a different kind of courage. Jairus, he was right in the middle of Capernaum society. This woman, she was on the edge. Her illness made her an outcast. And to me, there's a sense here, at least the way Mark describes it, of a woman who wants to reach out to Jesus, but who is scared to actually meet him. Jesus is the centre of attention, and she's on the edge. Jesus has power, she thinks, and she's powerless. Do you ever think that way? I'm not good enough, I'm not important enough, I'm not brave enough to come to Jesus and to say, help me. So we try and sneak up on him and not really engage with him. But Jesus wants a relationship. Jesus wants to know us face to face, not us trying to stay in the shadows. It takes courage to come to Jesus, but Jesus will always hear us. Jesus will always want that connection with us. Remember when we said that there was hope when Jesus spoke to Jairus after the news of his daughter's death? Don't be afraid, just believe, he says. Fear and faith, they often come together in the Gospels. Next week, we're going to be thinking about a time when Jesus walked on water to his disciples, and their first response? Fear. And then later, when Jesus begins to make his way to Jerusalem and to the cross, there's fear from his followers. And here Jesus says to Jairus, stop being afraid. Go on living by faith. It's present tense, the way it's written, present reality. You have faith. Come to me in hope and keep that faith. It's not easy, and maybe Jairus' faith is minuscule by this point, but it's enough. It's enough to keep him going. Who touched my clothes? Jesus asked in the middle of a crowd pressing around him. It's the most ridiculous question. There's such a huge number of people there. Everyone in some way must have touched him as they pushed and jostled along. Why ask the question? Jesus asks it because he really wants to know who it is. He really wants to know her. Touch is personal. For someone suffering as much as this woman, whose whole identity is bound up in her condition. She isn't given a name in Mark's story. She's described by her condition, a woman who's been subject to bleeding. And because of this condition, her society considers her to be religiously unclean. She's not allowed to enter the temple for worship. She's considered socially inferior. It's most likely that because of her condition, she hasn't been able to have children. Her illness, her condition defined her in every possible way, religiously, socially, even personally. And Jesus says, "Who touched my clothes?" And when the woman hears the question, she has to decide how to respond. She has to decide what to do. It's crowded. And for a woman who's used to keeping herself hidden, she could just slip back through the crowd and no one would have known, except Jesus. The only thing is, making it personal makes it public, and Jesus wants to know her. If she steps forward, if she makes that choice, it won't only be obvious to Jesus, it will be obvious to everyone else in the crowd. And here we are, back at courage again, stepping forward and connecting with Jesus for all to see. Mark tells us, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. I think she's afraid for all kinds of reasons. The crowd could have turned on her, an unclean woman. They could have turned on her, bringing all that uncleanliness into their town, into their city. Jesus might have been angry with her for not being open with him. He might even been angry with her for making him unclean by touching him. But he says gently and lovingly, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." It's not the size of her faith that's healed her. It's having the faith in the first place, small though it might have been, to make that connection with Jesus. Go in peace, he says. This isn't just physical healing, this is the healing of soul and spirit. And that brings us on to the last touch we find in this story, and that's the touch of restoration or salvation. There's a word repeated 3 times in the passage. That word is healed or made well. So when Jairus first approaches Jesus, he asks Jesus to put his hands on his daughter so that she will be healed and live. And then when the woman tries to touch Jesus' cloak, she thought if she could just touch him, she would be healed. And when Jesus speaks to her, he talks about how her faith has healed us. Healed makes sense because these people are ill in some way. But the same word that's translated as healed can also be translated as saved. There's something about connection with Jesus that is about more than getting physically better. It's a more holistic thing than that. We've just seen when he spoke to the woman, he said to her, "Go in peace and be free." Her life that is so characterised by turmoil and restriction is made peaceful and free. It's more than dealing with her physical condition. And with Jairus, as they make their way to his house and they hear the commotion of all the mourners and the crying, Jesus tells them, and he tells everyone else, "I can deal even with death." And when he says the little girl's asleep, it's not that she hasn't really died, it's that Jesus has power to waken her from death. And it's laughable to everyone, of course, but Jesus, he ignores their mockery and he lifts the little girl up from her bed. In the presence of Jesus, death has no power. It's not that people no longer physically die, of course. It's just that Jesus has defeated the finality of death. "Who touched my clothes?" asks Jesus. It's an invitation to come forward and to identify ourselves to Jesus, not to stay hidden, to come face to face with him. We don't need a huge amount of well thought out faith. We just need to reach out to him in hope and in courage. I was reading a book this week about this passage, and the writer says, when life crowds in with all its pressures, there is still room for us to creep up behind Jesus, if that's all we feel we can do, and reach out to touch him in that odd mixture of fear and faith that characterises so much Christian discipleship.